Welcome to the Climate Commission podcast, Climate Chats with Students. I'm your host, Sonya, and I'm the Climate Commission Officer for the Climate Commission, which is a unique partnership between Association of Colleges, EAUC, Guild HE, and Universities UK. And we've been working for the past year to coordinate climate action in the sector and develop a sector-wide consensus on responses to the climate emergency. On this episode, I chat with Ed Oswald, who is a recent graduate from the University of Surrey, and Ed offers some really interesting insight into his experience as a recent graduate from business management and also a young person who is concerned with the climate crisis. So I hope you enjoy. We're here today with Ed Oswald, who's just graduated from business management at the University of Surrey. And Ed was a part of our UNESCO Futures of Education discussion groups and contributed a lot of great insight to how education should be reformed for the future. So thanks for joining us, Ed.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I just have a few questions about your degree and how it interacts with sustainability, just so our listeners can get some insight into this topic. So why did you decide to study business management at the University of Surrey? And have you always had an interest in business, or, was it something that you sort of found later on in life?
Yeah, so I'll sort of answer that question in reverse, because I sort of think it leads into why I studied business. So cool. My mum actually owns a B&B / cafe / gift shop in a small village in Devon, where I'm from.
Wow.
And she's owned that my whole life, and then her parents owned it before her. So me and my brother grew up in the business. We spent sort of several hours a day, literally for our whole youth, in the business, eventually working there. And then at the age of, I was about 14 and my brother was 17, we set up this like ice cream business outside the front of the B&B. It was nothing too special, but it was basically just a cart on wheels that we'd sort of push around every day and set up and sell ice cream for 5 hours. So from like a very early age, we were both very interested in business, sort of accustomed to sort of the organizational format and just sort of the fundamentals of business. So it was sort of the logical degree for me to study. I wasn't overly enamored in any other field. And I was always fascinated by this sort of corporate lifestyle, going to work in London, earning loads of money, having loads of business meetings, sort of living this so-called high life. And for so long, it was my dream. And that was sort of the main justification for me choosing business going into university.
So it started off kind of as a thing you've just always grown around, like this idea of an entrepreneurial family, and then sort of expanded to this high life at like Canary Wharf or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. And so I guess at the opposite end, or it might not be the opposite end, but when did you first become interested in or concerned with the climate crisis?
Yeah, another good question. So I'd say, so my degree was a sandwich degree. So I had an industrial placement, a year in industry in my third year. And up until that point, I had no real interest or knowledge of sustainability, climate change, and sort of all these like plural injustices. And then my placement year was in a private equity firm in London, in St. Paul's next to Bank. So it was the dream up until that point. I'd finally done it. I'd landed this amazing job in this highly paid industry with sort of cutthroat professionals. It was everything I wanted. My parents were super proud. It was just a lot. And to be honest, for the first sort of 9 months, I absolutely loved it. I felt right at home. I felt sort of in my element. I was constantly being pushed and challenged. And then it was sort of ironic. So my supervisor was this sort of super moral, ethically aligned, righteous guy. And he always sort of, more than anything, he talked to me about veganism because he was vegan and animal rights. But he talked about loads of other social injustices. And for me, he's probably, apart from maybe my parents, the figure in my life that I've taken the most from and been most fascinated by. and sort of near the end of the year, I took to veganism first. He then lent me a book called Animal Liberation. I read that on holiday. And that was sort of the start of my journey towards sort of sustainability and environmentalism. And I think sort of the final straw before leaving the placement year and rejoining university for my final year was the Extinction Rebellion protests in London. I think my first sort of involvement or knowledge of them was the October Rebellion. I was actually this was October 2018.
Okay.
I was on a date with a girl by the river, and they were blocking Waterloo Bridge. And it was sort of on our, after we'd had a drink, we were just sort of walking around and came across this sort of festival like utopian state, where this bridge was just blocked with bright colourful flags, people dancing. It was just like the most crazy atmosphere, and we were both sort of drawn into it. And at the time I was like what's going on? I just didn't understand why they were there, what their purpose was, what they were standing for. And then I sort of read up a bit about them and then fell away until the following April when they had their second rebellion. I don't know if I got that the right way around, but it was over the two rebellions basically.
Right.
And the second one I got involved with. I turned up for a few of the days. I joined in. No sort of like, I hadn't taken on any serious role, but I was just sort of involved and engaged with the whole rebellion. And then from there, it sort of just spiraled on. So in going back into my final year, me and a few others set up a XR group on campus, and then sort of every opportunity to involve myself in sustainability or sort of in learning, in activism, in sort of just the wider community I'd involve myself in. And then over that year, up until this point, it's sort of been a whirlwind of various opportunities and an extreme amount of knowledge building.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting, because I feel like it's like more students, I guess, that I speak to that have an interest in sustainability. It's like a kind of a longer process, but I find it really interesting how, I guess, intense yours has been. And I think that's a testament, I guess, to your passion. I'm really interested in this supervisor that is a role model for you. So was this your supervisor during your, like, for your internship, or like your academic supervisor?
Yeah, no, this was during my my placement year.
How did you sort of perceive that sort of those sort of conversations? Because obviously you're in this business environment and you have this person kind of talking to you about everything that's not what you're working on, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a complicated question or not.
A little bit, but it's a fair question. I think so. He in himself, I think, struggled from time to time in working in that environment. He had slightly ulterior motives and a sort of different environment, different backdrop to work with. So his parents were struggling financially, and I think he wanted to support them in various ways. I guess, in a more privileged position that I didn't have that. I had no ulterior motive for me to go and earn a load of money or live a stable lifestyle. I could sort of make that fairly big decision from an early age that I don't need to pursue that sort of lifestyle. I can pursue more of an environmentally conscious or activist type lifestyle. But he also, I think, sort of maybe got to the slightly more sort of sinister, sort of less hopeful view on the environment in the world, in the state of like political affairs. I think he'd read up a lot. He's sort of that doomerism that surrounds everything. I think it got the better of him. And he's like, we live in this slightly messed up capitalist economy. There's no real avenue for change, so I'll just buy into it.
Yeah.
And that it's something I always questioned about him and where my position along that spectrum lies, because I can appreciate I might be very far, say, on the left or in terms of my engagement in activism. Most people won't be, and most people will choose to sort of shelter themselves away from it, because to put yourself in that position, you're doing one of a few things. You're potentially stripping away some of your privilege and the sort of the luxuries that you could have indulged in during your life.
Yeah.
Potentially putting yourself in danger. I mean, if you want to talk in terms of civil disobedience, in terms of the police, or in terms of sort of like social norm theories, you're potentially isolating yourself from a lot of groups because you might be seen as this sort of radical outsider, which is sometimes hard to do because as human beings, we want to conform, we want to
fit in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I sort of ran on a bit of a ramble there. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
no, it's really, really interesting. Yeah, I just find that kind of experience for someone so young is quite fascinating.
Yeah. What I would also just quickly like to interject is, so my sort of pathway into environmentalism, sustainability was through veganism. And now I'm at a point where I've pushed past maybe just environmentalism and sustainability towards a lot of other like broader social justice issues. And I think a takeaway could be however you get into sort of becoming interested in and wanting to tackle these plural injustices, just because you go in for a certain avenue doesn't mean that you can then expand yourself and learn more and more. And I think
definitely
it is a bit overwhelming sometimes when you just continually learn all the ways in which our world is just unjust and in a sort of self-defeating state. Yeah.
I also think it's just kind of a testament to like this idea that so you became interested through veganism, and now I mean there's so many, so there's like capitalism, racism, and I think it's just a testament to how interrelated all of it is, and how it's essentially just one thing, which is just oppression. And so I think that's fascinating. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about getting involved in the past 2 years with sustainability initiatives, especially starting an XR group at the University of Sussex. But does your interest in the climate crisis interact at all with your degree in business management? If so, how? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it?
So I would say there's no sort of smooth relationship between the two. They're not synonymous. So you've got business, or let's say late stage capitalism, which sort of founds itself. Well, how do you define business? To me, it's the trade of goods and services for money, typically. And late stage capitalism sort of looks at business in a way of maximizing profit and sort of continually increasing consumption. In its sort of simplest form, overconsumption and continued growth, whether that be GDP growth or any other metric of growth, requires continued extraction of resources and use of resources. And everyone knows we live on a finite planet. I think we're currently exploiting nature 1.7 times faster than our planet's ecosystems can regenerate it. So business in its sort of true historical sense, I would say is sort of very is very like
antithesis of
sustainability
in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a historical way of looking at it. There is definitely a new wave of business, sustainable business that's sort of exploded in the last, I don't know, say 5 to 10 years. And you've got all these alternative forms of organizations. So you've got like community interest companies, you've got social enterprises, you've got charities, you've got co-ops, you've got NGOs. And I think maybe they don't fit that traditional definition of business, but fundamentally they offer they offer what a business offers, which is the trade of goods or services. And I think we need those sort of businesses to exist and to thrive and to potentially even become the norm, become the majority, for us to be able to move to sort of a sustainable system in terms of goods and services, production and consumption. And maybe in terms of my degree more specifically, at Surrey, you've got, I think I had one module in my first year which was actually only half a module, which was the environment and sustainable business. And even with a lot of optional modules available, there was no real discussion around sustainable business or social enterprises, which to me is quite surprising, because maybe that's just sort of testament to my personality style, the people I choose to spend my time with. But I've got a fair few friends that are interested in business, but the green side of business, sustainable side of business. And I think as sort of young people become more educated on the climate crisis and sustainability more broadly, I think more and more people will want to go into sustainable business.
Yeah, interesting. So you had one module, but other than that, it was kind of your own sort of education and your own interest that propelled your interest in the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I think that's something we discussed on that Futures of Education sort of working group, is that it's our educational system, especially in the UK, isn't set up in a way to educate ourselves about sustainability and sort of a lot of social injustices. For people to be sort of clued up and knowledgeable on in those spaces, you've either got to be like me, someone that's self-motivated to go and learn and put themselves out there, or maybe working in the industry, or have family members or friends that will educate you. The systems aren't in place for that just to be sort of widespread knowledge.
So you were a part of the Futures for Education focus groups, and we talked about how education can prepare learners for a changing future. And so I guess my final question would be, how would you like to see business management and like classes in general, but also in universities and in higher education, taught in the future to fully consider the climate crisis and embed sustainability?
Yeah, so I did quite a lot of work sort of lobbying my university with this over the last year. I was part of the executive sustainability steering group at our university, which is sort of a cross-section of students, sort of academics and other stakeholders, sort of exploring how the business can sort of embed these sustainable values and become more sustainable in its own right. And a big area we discussed is sort of sustainability in the curriculum. In Surrey, the two main ways that they're looking to do that is, one is to introduce a sustainability module in every single degree. I don't know, I think that was once, so say it's a 3-year bachelor's degree, it'd be one module over the 3 years, or one module each year, I can't quite remember. But I think that's a great idea. So it will obviously be tailored to your sort of your pathway in academia. So for business, it would be sustainable business. So I think that's a great way of allowing students to still sort of pursue the path they want to and learn about the subject that they're paying to learn about, but in a sustainable way. And fundamentally, sustainability is going to be sort of one of the biggest sort of areas pressing our generation. So whatever field you're in, sustainability is going to be relevant in some facet. So it's important that you sort of find that hybrid or that crossover between your subject and sustainability. So yeah, I think one module relating to your degree, I think another thing Surrey is trying to do is sort of make sure that when course leaders create their module or the whole course, it's how does sustainability relate to every sort of micro topic that they teach? Because then almost everything they teach will have some relevancy to sustainability. And then something that I did spend the last year doing, and I believe quite a lot of other universities do, is sort of an additional optional module for those really interested in sustainability. So ours was a sort of a 16-week module, 2 hours a week with various assignments, just learning about all the different areas of sustainability. So my knowledge up until that point was fairly insular in terms of climate change and veganism, but there's so much more out there. Even like it's amazing, almost every niche, every subject can relate to sustainability, whether that's psychology, sociology, I don't know, like medicine, just chemistry, there's a relationship between every subject and sustainability. There's also various online courses, like I know the University of Exeter do a climate change course on FutureLearn, and there's a lot of other sort of educational resources and free classes out there for students to engage in. I answered the original question sort of on a more broader scope. In terms of business management, I think there's just some modules, so more optional modules for student, and maybe even some compulsory modules on, certainly on the different organizational forms out there. Most business students are conditioned throughout their whole degree to focus on profiteering and sort of maximizing the bottom line, but just sort of the knowledge and to be able to learn about these different organizational forms and the different motivations there can be for establishing a business. And then I suppose some like anecdotal stories of like thought leaders and businesses that are truly championing green business, and how we can sort of do what we've done historically, but in a better way that benefits others rather than just those in sort of management or shareholder positions.
Completely.
And then in terms of sort of primary and secondary education, I think that is a whole nother conversation. I think a big thing in sort of certainly primary school is just changing what students learn to an extent. I think there's a lot of sort of practical subjects that aren't taught. So sort of practical in terms of like real life subjects like trade skills, gardening, cooking, financial management. And then I also think they need to be sort of taught about some of the bigger issues in our world. I get it might be a lot for an 8-year-old's brain to comprehend, but just stuff about like racism, bigotry, social inequalities, the biosphere, globalization. You can do it in a sort of a dumbed down, simple to understand way, but sort of engaging students from a really young age in these big issues that will affect them and affect others, I think is really important.
Just to start thinking about it, even if you don't completely understand it, just to begin thinking about it, I think.
Exactly.
Actually, I don't know if you were in this group in particular, but one student mentioned that like with business and with economics, like it's constantly taught, which is what you kind of mentioned, like with the whole degrowth idea, whereas I constantly taught rather that it's just about kind of producing like infinite resources and infinitely kind of consuming, whereas we live on like a finite planet. So so it's kind of like restructuring how we teach all these ideas.
Well, there's just quickly on that, maybe to finish up, there's so this all boils down to sort of GDP being the main sort of metric that every country uses to measure success, and it's, are there other sort of variables that we should take into consideration? So it has the gross national happiness index, which I think has sort of 9 measures to sort of ensure equal consideration, not just economic aspects of well-being. And then you've got, I think New Zealand have just introduced like a framework of metrics to run alongside GDP. I think there's like 61 metrics that they're measuring, and it just shows how up until this point, certainly post World War II, the world has just been focused on GDP and increased consumption, increased exchange of artificial money, because money is this artificial concept at the end, rather than focusing on the population's well-being, which to me is the important thing. That sort of countries and governments should focus on.
So we have this overview if you're interested in business management and you're interested in sustainability and the climate crisis. And I just want to know a bit more about how you see the two of those interests coming into play in your future. So do you have any plans? I know this is quite a big question. I know everything's so uncertain with COVID, but how do you see sustainability and business come into play in your future?
Good question. It's something that I've grappled with a lot in the last year, especially given the rate of change in terms of my ambitions in life and interests, I'd say my future, more than anything, I'd love to work in some sort of pro-environmental role, and sort of sustainability and environment is a very, very wide sort of subject range, or there's so many niches you could specialize in, given that I don't know, greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable food production, biodiversity loss, plastic pollution. There's so much out there, and it's overwhelming for someone like me who's relatively new to it. Where do I sort of focus my efforts and my skills, my time? It would make sense from an outsider's point of view for me to go into sort of sustainable or green business, or given my placement year was in finance, do I go into sort of sustainable green finance, ESG, sort of impact investment sort of stuff? And I guess the question I've been struggling with is, do I buy into a system? So we're talking about like neoliberal economics, capitalism. Do I buy into a system that is fundamentally, to my eyes anyway, sort of broken, unsustainable? But do I go on sort of the green left side of it? Do I try and change the system from within? Do I try and be part of a group of people that sort of demolish the establishment, let's say, or try and recreate the system? I'm a big believer in a lot of these sort of like new economical models, and even ideas like degrowth and I can't think of others, but
like circular economies and
exactly that sort of stuff. So where I fit in that whole system, I don't really know. I imagine it will be, I see it as one of three things. One would be sort of green finance, because we're never going to move away from the need for capital. It's just how that capital is used. So maybe there's a great bank in the UK called Triodos. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're based in Bristol, where I've just moved to. They're a Dutch bank that have very, very strong core sort of ethical and moral standards. So we'll only invest in renewable energies, try and prioritize their lending to sort of charities and social enterprises and stuff like that. So maybe working in a business like that would be interesting. Or I think there's always that sort of overwhelming trifecta question: who is responsible, or who is going to be who's going to lead the change that we need to see in this world? Is it individuals? Is it corporations? Is it the government? I am a big believer that it's the government amongst all else that can lead the change that we need to see. So I see myself most likely ending up in some sort of like political advisory sort of role of sort of political research. So that a great business that, if any of the listeners haven't checked out, that definitely should, is the New Economics Foundation, which is a fairly small think tank in London, and they're just constantly researching and pushing for these slightly alternative sort of economic social systems. So someone like that, maybe. I think the takeaway is my degree is not going to be solely useful in its traditional sense. I probably won't go into green business, but a lot of the skills and sort of knowledge I've learned from my degree can be applicable in whatever path I follow.
Yeah, I totally empathize with the whole like kind of your role in whether to be a part of a system that you don't agree with so you can change it, or just dismantle the entire system. And I think our generation's at a pretty interesting spot really with COVID and with the climate crisis, where maybe they'll just be dismantled anyway. So thank you so much for speaking with me, Ed. I think this was really interesting. I think business and environment is like a fascinating intersection, and they can be so incompatible, but they could also be compatible. So thanks for shedding light on that.
That's okay. Yeah.
And just email me.